Michelle Pfeiffer and Jack Nicholson, two names that once set Hollywood alight. But behind their legendary chemistry, there was something no one ever saw. Something Michelle has only just found the courage to speak about. At 67, she's finally revealed what Jack Nicholson did to her. And after all these years, her truth changes everything we thought we knew about both of them. When they worked together, she was young, untested, and still learning how to survive a business that devoured the unguarded. He was already a force of nature, brilliant, unpredictable, and utterly fearless. What happened between them left a mark that never faded. For decades, Michelle stayed silent. She avoided the questions, changed the subject, smiled when his name came up. But now she's ready to tell her story. Not the one the tabloids invented, but the one she lived. And once you hear what really happened, you'll understand why she could never forget him. Before she was the woman commanding movie screens with quiet strength, Michelle Pfeiffer was a young actress trying to be heard in a world that rarely listened. Born in Santa Ana, California, in the late 1950s, she grew up far from the glamour of Hollywood. Her father worked in air conditioning, her mother was a housewife, and Michelle was a shy, observant child who preferred stillness to noise. She never dreamed she'd end up beside giants like Al Pacino or Jack Nicholson. Yet, by the early 1980s, that's exactly where she was headed. Her early years in the business were brutal. After small television parts and forgettable films, she landed Grease 2, which was meant to make her a star. Instead, it nearly ruined her career. Critics were merciless, studios lost interest, and casting directors dismissed her as another pretty face. Michelle later said that failure was her first real education. It taught her that beauty was currency, but talent was survival, and she was determined to earn respect. That determination led her to Scarface in 1983. Acting opposite Al Pacino, she played Elvira Hancock, fragile, cold, and detached. The performance changed everything. People suddenly saw that beneath the surface calm was a woman of extraordinary depth. Yet the praise brought new pressure. She was still in her 20s, still learning how to protect herself in an industry run by men who blurred the lines between admiration and control. Hollywood, at the time, celebrated confidence but punished sensitivity, and Michelle had both. Between Scarface and The Witches of Eastwick, she worked constantly, chasing roles that would prove she could be more than beautiful. But each set carried the same unspoken hierarchy. Charismatic leading men held the power, and women were expected to adapt to their rhythm. She watched how others bent under it, how charm could silence, how fear could become obedience. Privately, she promised herself she would never let that happen. Still, something in her wanted to be tested, to work opposite someone who could draw out every part of her she kept hidden. By the mid-80s, her reputation was growing: smart, committed, graceful under pressure. Directors loved her discipline. Co-stars admired her professionalism. But there was one quality she hadn't yet discovered: how to command chaos. That moment came when her phone rang about a new Warner Brothers project called The Witches of Eastwick. She would play one of three women, opposite Jack Nicholson, who had already become a myth. Colleagues warned her, "He's unpredictable, he'll push you." But Michelle didn't flinch. She said yes. As production began in 1986, she stepped into a world she'd never known. One where every take was a challenge, every scene a duel. Nicholson wasn't just acting. He was testing boundaries. He threw out lines, ignored marks, and rewrote the emotional tone of entire scenes with a glance or a laugh. Michelle had never seen anything like it. She'd studied scripts her whole life, and now she was face to face with a man who seemed to exist outside of them. In that moment, her earlier promise, never to be overpowered, was tested for the first time. What Jack Nicholson did to her began long before anyone yelled action. It began the moment she realized that control, the thing she had fought to keep, might be exactly what she'd have to let go of to survive him on screen. When The Witches of Eastwick began filming in 1986, Michelle Pfeiffer was stepping into uncharted territory. The set felt charged from the start, not just because of its story about women discovering their power, but because of the man who stood at its center. Jack Nicholson wasn't simply a co-star, he was a storm. Every day brought a new version of him, unpredictable and impossible to prepare for. Michelle had heard stories. Everyone had. Nicholson was known for improvising, for changing the rhythm of a scene until the actors around him either broke or found something real. The first time she looked across the set and saw him in character, she felt it, that mix of awe and fear that only certain people can create. When cameras rolled, Jack's eyes never blinked, his tone never softened, and his energy filled every inch of the room. For Michelle, it was both thrilling and terrifying. She'd spent years perfecting control, studying scripts, memorizing every detail, entering each role with quiet precision. But Jack didn't play by rules. He tore through them. One day he'd crack a joke mid-scene and leave the entire crew laughing. The next he'd go dark, silent, and suddenly shift the mood with a stare. No one ever knew which version they'd get, and that uncertainty pushed Michelle past every comfort zone she'd built. There were moments when she wanted to walk off set, to escape the chaos he created, yet something in her refused. She'd promised herself she'd never be overpowered, and now she was standing across from a man who embodied everything that frightened her about Hollywood: the freedom, the ego, the danger of letting go. And strangely, she couldn't look away. The film's director, George Miller, encouraged her to lean into that discomfort. He saw how Nicholson's volatility pulled something new out of her, something honest. In one scene, Michelle's character was meant to react with shock and fear as Nicholson's Daryl Van Horn unleashed his wicked charm. Jack didn't warn her what he was going to do. He changed the tone mid-sentence, his laughter sudden and unrestrained, his words sharper than scripted. The fear on Michelle's face in that take wasn't acting, it was real. For years, she would avoid watching that scene. It reminded her how vulnerable she'd felt, how completely out of control she'd been. But looking back now, she admits it was the turning point. That's when I understood what real acting felt like. She once reflected. It's not about control, it's about surrender. Off camera, Nicholson's behavior remained an enigma. One minute he was generous and charming, the next he was distant, lost in thought. Michelle couldn't tell where the man ended and the character began. He seemed to draw energy from the tension he created around him, from keeping everyone guessing. It was exhausting, but it was also magnetic. When filming ended, she left Eastwick changed. She'd survived Jack's storm, but part of her couldn't stop replaying it. The fear he awakened wasn't just about acting, it was about facing herself, her insecurities, her desire to please, her need to stay safe. For the first time she realized that fear could be a teacher, and though she wouldn't understand it fully for years, what Jack had done to her on that set was far more profound than anything written in the script. 7 years passed before Michelle Pfeiffer and Jack Nicholson would stand opposite each other again. In those years between The Witches of Eastwick and Wolf, Michelle became the actress everyone in Hollywood wanted. The Fabulous Baker Boys, Dangerous Liaisons, Batman Returns. Each film carved away the uncertainty she once felt. She learned to command silence on screen, to let stillness say what words could not. But even as her confidence grew, there remained one ghost from her past she hadn't yet faced: Jack. When Wolf was announced in 1994, it felt like destiny. The story, about a man who transforms into something wild and untamable, mirrored everything their dynamic had ever been. But this time, Michelle wasn't the young actress finding her footing. She was a force in her own right. She no longer looked up at Nicholson as a legend. She looked across at him as an equal. From the first day of filming, the energy between them was different. Nicholson noticed it immediately. Gone was the timid woman from Eastwick. In her place was someone who met his gaze without flinching. Their scenes together crackled, not with fear, but with power. They pushed each other, trading lines like punches, each moment unpredictable yet controlled. For the first time, Michelle understood his language, the rhythm of chaos, the beauty in risk. Jack had once thrown her off balance. Now she could dance in the storm. When he veered off script, she followed, not as prey but as a partner. When he laughed too loudly or lingered too long in silence, she held her ground. What he'd awakened years earlier, that instinct to let go, had become her greatest strength. Crew members would later describe their dynamic as electric. "You could feel it," one said. "They didn't just act, they collided." Yet beneath the surface was something softer, a quiet acknowledgement between two people who had already seen each other's depths. Jack respected her in a way he hadn't before. He no longer tried to pull her out of herself, he let her lead. For Michelle, the experience felt redemptive. Wolf wasn't just another movie, it was closure. She no longer feared the unpredictability that had once consumed her. She now understood that what Jack brought to every set wasn't chaos for chaos' sake. It was his method of finding truth, and in learning to adapt to it, she had discovered her own kind of freedom. In one particularly intense scene, Nicholson's character confesses to feeling both beast and man. As cameras rolled, his eyes locked on hers, and for a brief moment, it wasn't acting. It was two people acknowledging how far they'd come, from fear to respect, from intimidation to equilibrium. Michelle later said that Wolf taught her something she couldn't learn in any classroom. That power is never about control, it's about presence. When filming ended, she felt lighter, almost relieved. She had faced the man who once frightened her, and found strength instead of fear. What Jack Nicholson did to her back in Eastwick no longer haunted her, it defined her. It showed her how to own the space she once tried to survive in. For years, Michelle Pfeiffer avoided explaining what it was really like to work with Jack Nicholson. People saw their chemistry and assumed it was easy, that two charismatic stars simply met and magic happened. But Michelle later admitted it wasn't that simple. When she finally reflected on those years, she said she had been terrified of him on The Witches of Eastwick, not because he was unkind, but because he was uncontainable. Nicholson had a way of dominating space. He'd walk on set and instantly change the temperature of the room. Directors leaned into his chaos. It gave scenes an energy no one could plan for. Michelle, who came from a more measured approach, had to adjust. She described those early days as nerve-wracking, and said she often went home feeling unsure of herself. He could make her laugh one moment and completely throw her off balance the next. Yet when she watched the finished film, she saw something in her own performance that surprised her. Something raw, unfiltered, real. That was when she began to understand what had happened. Nicholson hadn't meant to intimidate her. He was pulling her into his process. He believed truth came from risk, and that safety was the enemy of honesty. Michelle's instinct had always been to prepare, to perfect, but around Jack, she couldn't predict a thing. He forced her to let go, to react, to listen, to feel, and even though she didn't recognize it at the time, that experience would shape every role she took afterward. When Wolf reunited them in 1994, the dynamic had changed. Michelle was no longer the uncertain young actress trying to prove herself. She was now the one setting the tone, matching Nicholson's rhythm without losing her own. It was then, looking across at him, that she finally understood what he had done years earlier. He had, without saying a word, challenged her to stop seeking approval. He'd shown her that control could be a prison, and that true power was being able to stand in the storm and not disappear. In later interviews, she spoke about how much she learned from that period, not only about acting, but about herself. Nicholson, she said, operates on instinct. Working with him taught her to trust hers. He had taught her to stay present, to stop planning her next move, to meet the moment fully. It was one of the hardest lessons of her career, but also one of the most valuable. The truth is, what Jack Nicholson did to Michelle Pfeiffer wasn't something dramatic or cruel. It was something transformative. He made her confront her own fear, the fear of losing control, of being unprepared, of not being enough. And when she survived that, when she discovered she could hold her own beside a force like him, she changed forever. When she looks back now, there's no bitterness in her voice, only understanding. She often says she's grateful for every challenge that taught her who she was. Working with Nicholson was the most intense of them all. It left her shaken at first, but stronger in the end. A woman who learned that sometimes the very thing that frightens you most becomes the thing that sets you free. After Wolf, Michelle Pfeiffer didn't talk much about Jack Nicholson. When interviewers mentioned him, she smiled politely, offered a few kind words, and moved on. The truth was never bitter, only complicated. The experience had left an imprint she needed time to process. For years she focused on new roles, new directors, and building a career that was hers alone. She didn't want her name to live in someone else's shadow, even one as legendary as Jack's. In the 2000s, as she stepped back from acting to focus on her family, she spoke occasionally about how Hollywood had changed, how women were finally being allowed to lead without apology. But underneath those reflections was something quieter, an understanding that her own growth had come from surviving the kind of intensity few actresses could. When she finally returned to the screen in Hairspray, Stardust, and later Ant-Man and the Wasp, there was a calmness in her presence that hadn't been there before. She no longer tried to prove herself, she simply was. It was only later, when time softened the edges of memory, that she began to speak more openly about the past. She recalled The Witches of Eastwick as one of the most intimidating sets of her life. She called Nicholson brilliant, dangerous, and completely alive. There was no resentment in her tone, only respect. She understood now that he had represented something larger than one man. He embodied the world she was trying to survive, a world where women had to fight twice as hard to be seen as equals. When she looked back at herself in those days, the young woman who trembled before walking on set, afraid of forgetting her lines or being outshined, she no longer felt shame. She felt compassion. Every moment of fear, every unpredictable scene, had prepared her for a lifetime of holding her ground. The truth she reveals now isn't about Nicholson's behavior, but about her own awakening. I learned, she once said, that the thing you're most afraid of is often the thing that frees you. I self or she wendoels and hers, I self and the thing that frees you. Her silence for decades wasn't avoidance. It was self-preservation. She needed distance from the noise of Hollywood, from gossip that reduced women to rumors and chemistry to romance. When she finally did speak, her honesty carried the weight of years lived and lessons learned. She didn't romanticize Nicholson or diminish him. She simply told the truth as she saw it, that he had terrified her, challenged her, and ultimately helped her see herself more clearly. The story of what Jack Nicholson did to Michelle Pfeiffer isn't one of scandal. It's the story of transformation, how one artist's chaos became another's clarity. He taught her that vulnerability isn't weakness, and that true power doesn't come from control but from presence. When she later appeared in French Exit in 2020, playing a woman facing aging, loss, and reinvention, critics noticed something different. There was no fear in her eyes, no uncertainty in her movements. She radiated the kind of authority that only comes from having walked through fire and come out whole. Today, Michelle Pfeiffer's legacy isn't defined by the men she worked with, but by the grace and endurance with which she navigated them. She represents an entire generation of actresses who learned to stand tall in rooms built to make them small. Her truth about Jack Nicholson isn't a confession or accusation, it's gratitude wrapped in understanding. She once feared his presence. Now she honors what it taught her. At 67, she has nothing left to prove. She's achieved what she once thought impossible, lasting respect in a business that forgets its own heroes. What Jack did to her was simple and profound. He made her face herself. And in doing so, He helped her find the kind of confidence that doesn't fade when the cameras stop rolling. Michelle Pfeiffer's silence was never about hiding, it was about healing. And when she finally chose to speak, it wasn't to revisit the past, it was to show that every moment of fear can become the foundation of strength. That is the truth she reveals now. That is what she carries forward. Michelle Pfeiffer's story isn't about conflict, scandal, or regret. It's about how one experience can alter the course of an entire life. What Jack Nicholson did to her wasn't something that could be measured in headlines or gossip columns. He forced her to confront her fear, to stand her ground, and to realize that she belonged in every room she entered. For decades, she carried that lesson quietly, never needing to explain it. But now, as she looks back on her journey, the meaning has become clear. Jack's chaos taught her discipline. His unpredictability taught her patience. His power taught her presence. And through it all, Michelle discovered that strength isn't loud, it's steady. Today, her truth isn't about what she endured, but what she became. She learned that courage can come from the most uncomfortable places, and that sometimes, the people who test you most leave behind the lessons you need the longest. Michelle Pfeiffer didn't just survive Hollywood's storm, she mastered it. And the woman she is now stands as proof that even the hardest moments can become the reason we rise. For more emotional stories, check out this video.